tuning in to our first few public live streams of one of our demonstrations here at the Toledo Museum of Art Glass Pavilion. My name is Jake, and I'm going to be assisting and narrating for Colin here, and he's going to be our gaffer this afternoon. Before he gets started, I'll just kind of briefly go over some of the equipment that we have here in our extensive studio at the Glass Pavilion, and then we can kind of get into the process. So the first main piece of equipment that you'll see here in the screen is our reheating chamber. And this reheating chamber here is what we use to obviously reheat a big drum of fire that's holding at about 2,150 degrees. And this is where Colin is going to be doing the majority of the working of the material. And then when we move down, we can see some of our stainless steel pipes here in our pipe warmer. And those are preheating the pipes, allowing them to get up to a temperature where we can gather out of our last main piece of equipment. And that is our furnace right over here in the corner. And this is where we use to gather the material out. And this is around a 700-pound furnace, and it's also holding at that 2,150 degrees. So what Colin is going to be making today is going to be making a really nice base form. And we've got some color laid out here that we'll go into a little bit, but Colin can probably go ahead and get started. So now that the pipe has been in there, we can kind of see that the tip of that pipe is a nice cherry red, and that's how we know that we're ready to gather that glass out of the furnace. So when we're gathering out of our furnace, Colin slides his pipe in on the sill, does multiple rotations inside the glass, and then he pulls that material up and out. And to get enough material, Colin's going to be doing a double dip. And that's essentially taking roughly 1.5 gathers of material. We kind of have to gather in layers. We can't get all the material that we need out at once. So he waits a second, kind of lets the glass stabilize a little bit, and then he goes in for his second gather. So he's got a considerable amount more of material. And every time we gather, that kind of exponentially increases. And now that we have all of that molten material, we're rolling into the color. And we can colorize the glass in many different ways and varieties, but what we're using now is called frit. And we can see here that the frit is in larger varying sizes of chunks. It's basically just crushed up or pulverized glass. And I can bring this up for a bit closer view. So here we can see we have a nice variety of blue mixes and colors. Now that we have our first layer of color, Colin's going into our reheating chamber and melting in that color and going back and applying a second layer to fill in any gaps that we didn't fill before. Now that we have that nice and melted in, we're going to go ahead and shape that up using a tool called a block. And the blocking tool, you can see right here, is carved out of cherry wood, this spoon here. And the cherry wood is a really, really great wood for this tool because it holds a lot of water and it has kind of a high or a tight grain patterning in it. So with that wood being waterlogged, when it comes into contact with the glass, it creates a barrier of steam. So any smoke that you're seeing coming up here is actually steam as the molten glass kind of evaporates that layer of water that's built into that wood. Now that we kind of have this more evened out shape and everything is smoothed in and homogeneous with itself, we can go ahead and introduce the bubble into the glass and begin to shape a hollow form. So in order to kind of mitigate the ability for me to blow for Colin, because normally I would be the one blowing for Colin, he has a blow hose that he can conveniently place under his mask to do any sort of blowing. So we have the majority of this glass nice and even temperature. The coldest portion of the material is what's touching that blowpipe, but all of that mass is nice and evened out in temperature. So when Colin introduces air into the pipe with that blow hose, the only way that that air can escape the pipe is by introducing itself and pushing into that molten material. So we've got a nice little bubble that's beginning to form, just by applying a light pressure into that blow hose. Just making sure that it's all nice and evened out, making sure the bubble is expanding all the way through nice and evenly. And this tool that he has in his hand right now is what we call newspaper. That's all it is, plain and simple. It's just 5 to 6 sheets folded up into thirds twice, and it's also waterlogged very similarly to the block. So that way that water creates that barrier of steam between our hand and the glass. So now that we have this nice and shaped up here, as we can see, we've got everything nice and homogeneous, all the colors melted in. We don't have any inconsistencies in that bubble. So now we just need to kind of wait a little bit, let the glass stabilize, and then we'll take our third and final gather of material before we start finalizing the shape of our piece. So glass is kind of like a waiting game in that way, where we kind of have to let it stabilize. So take a nice little flash to burn off any ash or soot from the newspaper, and then he goes in to take his final gather here. And this gather is going to exponentially increase the size of the piece, because not only is it a pretty large amount of material to begin with, but it now has a hollow opening, so it's much larger. He goes ahead and pulls his pipe a little bit so that way he has good control and leverage over all of that weight that we just added to the end of the pipe. Now that we have that new fresh layer of glass, we need to use the blocking tool one more time in order to even out, homogenize that entire mass of material, kind of get that new fresh layer under control. So when we're using the blocking tool, it's important that we roll back and forth nice and evenly on the bench, allowing the material to disperse itself throughout that entire body of glass that we have at the end of the rod. Now that we have that shaped up, Colin goes ahead and hooks up his blow hose so that way he's ready to blow when he comes back to the bench, and then he's evening out the temperature so that way our bubble is going to expand nice and evenly when we go to do the shaping. Glass out to the bench, he pulls the block out to do one final skimming on the surface to make sure that it's nice and cooled down right on the very external layer of material. So now he begins to blow into his blow hose, and he can kind of use the newspaper to control what areas are inflating and what areas are kind of cooling down and not able to expand as rapidly. So he's going to take this heat, going to kind of set himself up for the form that he's going for. We're kind of going for a nice face with a swoop neck and a kind of a larger body. So we need to kind of make sure that the glass isn't going to expand as rapidly on the tip, because the tip of this bubble is going to be the bottom of the piece, and we want to retain thickness there. So Colin's making sure he's getting the majority of the material nice and hot, and then he brings it over to our marburing table, which is just a bed of carbon steel that just rapidly pulls the heat out of the glass. We can see he's kind of pointed that up a little bit, and he's blowing into the blow hose. And you can see some of that expansion happening more closer to the pipe. So by doing that, that kind of sets him up for the form that he's going for. So we kind of moved the majority of that material and retained a lot of that thickness towards the tip of the bubble. And as we introduce that heat, the rest of the material is heating up much faster than that tip that we just rolled on the marble. So by angling down at the bench here, Colin is stretching that glass out, and now he's adding in our constriction line using the tool called the jacks. And the jacks are kind of one of the most iconic glass blowers tools. You won't really see it in any other practice. And it's theorized that the ancient Romans designed it out of a pair of sheep shears some 2,000 years ago. So that tool has gone relatively unchanged, just like the majority of the processes you see us using here today. So now that we have that constriction line added, that's going to be the point of stress at which we break the piece and remove it from the pipe later. So that line is also our line of symmetry, or where the piece is centered onto our blowpipe. So when he heats in the reheating chamber now, you can see he's not introducing the full bit of glass inside the reheating chamber, because that's our point of stability and symmetry. So you'll see him take brief, what we call flashes or short heats of the entire body of material, but for the most part, we're slowly moving down the body of the piece. And what you just saw him do there was, again, just a little bit of stretching, just boosting the heat in the lower portion of the vessel and allowing gravity to do the majority of the work for us by hanging down. The glass just kind of pulls and stretches. So now that we have our form elongated, Colin's using that newspaper to kind of constrict down and create that waste that we need in our form, and blowing simultaneously. We can see where the majority of the heat is focused in on this body of glass. It's more towards that base, and that's where the majority of our thickness is at as well. So by kind of squeezing in that taper and blowing, that's allowing that bulbous body to really begin to blow out and kind of disperse some of that thickness. Rolling back in, he's taking a nice flash, again, kind of making sure that that glass connected to the pipe doesn't get too cold, because if it dips below a certain temperature, that glass is really susceptible to thermal shock, and we could lose the piece from our pipe. So he's going ahead and bringing it back to the bench, doing a little bit more stretching on the way, kind of lengthening out that waist in the form. Going back on with the newspaper again. He's really trying to set up this shape, because this is one of the few times that our opportunities that we'll have to do it. So most of the shaping is done on our blowpipe. So he's really trying to use that newspaper to isolate what areas are expanding. Now that we have our form kind of blown out a little bit more, he can do any sort of fine tuning before we add in a flattened bottom or a foot. And then we'll transfer the piece over to a punty rod, or a separate pipe that's used to finish the piece and make it a nice and open form. Bring this over so you guys can see a little bit better in the camera. We can see that blue mix is starting to show in its final color a little bit. We have our form the majority of the way blown out. And we're going to go ahead and add on what we call a cookie foot. And a cookie foot is a separate addition of material that we need on our punty rod right here. And I can break this up and show this. This is just a solid stainless steel rod that we have here. And I'm going to use this to gather bits of molten material, all clear glass out of our furnace. So in the meantime, while I'm gathering up for this punty, Colin is making sure that the piece is nice and stable and even temperature all the way through. So I'm just going to take a couple gallons of material out of the furnace here until I have enough in order to make a nice and solid foot for Colin's vessel. Straight up and down here on our margaring table, which almost instantly cools the glass down. And I cut off a little patty of material for Colin to bring over and can stick that on the bottom of his piece. And he kind of lightly tags that so he can find center. Now that we have this little patty of material on the bottom of our vessel, Colin can shape this and get it nice and tapered. But we're now introducing the majority of the heat to that foot. So by kind of squeezing his fingers in under that lip and using his thumb to press into the center, we can shape this up into a nice tapered and solid foot. Excellent. And now, just to make sure it's nice and crisp, I'm going to go on here with this cherry wood paddle just to make sure that everything is nice and flat and we don't have any wobble in the foot. Excellent. Now that we have that foot added, we have our point of stability for the piece to rest when it's completed. So this is all of the shaping that we're going to be doing on the blowpipe. So now we need to bring what's called a punty, and that's my job here. So a punty is just a rod like this. It's a step-down punty. And this allows me to gather a little bit of material that's almost going to act like glue and stick to the bottom of Colin's vessel. So what I'm doing here is just adding and cooling certain areas of this and giving it a very particular shape. There's a million different ways to make a punty depending on what you need it for, the purpose that it's serving you. But for this shape here is just tapered with a dome of glass and a slight point. And this is a design that's intentionally designed to fail when we need it to. So this little bit of material on the end of my pipe is going to have enough strength to hold up Colin's vessel. As amazing and surprising as that sounds, it is true. So giving this that nice tapered shape. Got our little bit of material here at the end of the rod. I'm just going to add a little bit of heat into this punty because, again, that margarin table sucks the heat out of the glass. So Colin is nice and stable here. He's been flashing as I was making that punty. Now I bring it over. Colin just uses his tweezers to guide that piece of material and stick it as on center as he can visually, and then once it's connected, he can find any high points. So now we're just kind of waiting. The punty was a little warm, and now we can go ahead and break it off. So just a little bit of water shocks that material, and a light vibration on the pipe removes it just like that. Now we have a successful transfer. That's usually the most stressful part of the process. Now I'm just flashing the piece, making sure that the temperature is nice and even, and then I bring it over to Colin. While there's still a little bit of heat added into that punty, again, we can take another second after the piece is transferred to check and make sure that everything is nice and in line and symmetrical. Now this is usually the longest heat of the process. This is where we are basically flipping the direction of the heat. So it usually takes maybe about 2 minutes because we're adding in about another 1,000 degrees back into the material. That portion that just broke was cold enough to break. So we have to get that molten enough to where we can begin stretching and pulling that glass out and giving it its final form. So what Colin is looking for and what I'm starting to see is for the majority of that material that's focused in the reheating chamber begin to move. when we're working with glass, really the only tell that we have when we're in the reheating chamber is how the material is moving. Because when you're looking in that reheat, past that line is basically waste. So we don't need it in the piece, so we're just going to remove it by breaking it off. Before we do that, he takes a quick flash to make sure everything is nice and homogeneous temperature. So he goes in, makes sure everything is nice and tight, everything is nice and ready to go. Cooling off the inside and the outside wall. He crimps in on it with his shears to really make sure that it's nice and cold, and then a little tap with a pair of tweezers will break this piece free. Now that we have removed that excess thickness and material, we now have a nice even line where we had it broken off. And just to make sure that everything is nice and flat, I'll go on with this cherry wood paddle when Colin comes back to the bench after this heat. So in order to open the vessel, Colin just uses the blades of his jacks in a different orientation. He's holding them horizontally or parallel to the floor, and just slowly begins opening the blades, and that's just stretching the material, and we're creating that nice flared lip of our form. Now that we've done our initial opening, we're now going to give it that nice flare. So Colin's making sure that everything is nice and heated up all the way down the form, right before we hit the bulbous body of the piece. So before we begin flaring, Colin's going on with his newspaper just to correct that little waist and make sure that waist is a nice and even, solid curve. Again, it kind of works the same way. As we're blowing the form out, we're slowly directing the heat further along the bubble. So now that we have the piece flipped over, we're doing the same thing. We're kind of working further and further out on the body of the piece. So only the lip is really what needs to have the majority of that heat focused. So he's going in with the blades of his jacks. I'm going to go on with the paddle to make sure it's nice and level, nice and even. Just by changing the angle, he's reinforcing that curve and giving the lip of the piece a nice flare. He's going to do that one more time just to get it set exactly the way that he would like it. See that heat is really focused right on the lip of the piece. Nice. Now we have our nice curve, our nice flared lip, and I think that's the most of the shaping that we're going to be doing here on this piece. So Colin's going to flash it, he'll bring it up so you guys can see it a little bit better, and then we'll begin the process of preparing to remove the piece from the pipe. So we're really starting to be able to see our nice blues coming out, but these colors are still not completely true to what they will really look like once the piece is cooled down. It's because glass color is produced by different types of metal. Different metals heat up at different rates. And when the metal gets hot, it's going to glow orange. So That's why you'll see the majority of glass flashes, making sure everything is nice and even. Because we have that thick and solid foot, that's going to cool down at a bit of a slower rate than the rest of the piece, because it has that thickness and retains that heat a lot better than our hollow form. And these flashes are also important in making sure that punty is heated up enough to where we can stress it with water and remove it from the pipe nice and cleanly. And now that he's taking his final flashes here, I'm just going to go ahead and come off frame for a second and suit up here at our knockoff table with a face shield and some Kevlar gloves in order to handle the piece in the quick transport from our knockoff table into our annealing oven. I'll preheat these gloves just a little bit here. Colin's going to go ahead and take one more final flash. And bring it on over to our reheating chamber. For our knockoff table. So we have this really, really handy tool, a little needle nose bottle that allows us to really pinpoint where we're applying that water, making sure that we're not crizzling the bottom of our piece. And a little vibration will shock the glass just like that. We have a nice clean break, but we still have some sharp and jagged edges. So we have our OxyPro torch, basically an at-home lightsaber. We're able to melt away that sharp spot, and we have our nice handy TMA glass stamp that will finalize the piece. Excellent. Now that we have it nice and stamped, one final look before we put the piece away. There we have our finished piece. So the process now is in the hands of our annealing oven. And the annealing oven is a very, very important tool for our process in glass blowing. Because the glass that we're using in our studio is a soda lime glass, that means it is a soft glass. So essentially what that means is it is very susceptible to thermal shock. So all of the flashing that Colin was doing to the piece right before we removed it is to even out the temperature and get it to a nice and stable, roughly 1,000 degrees to 950, because this piece of equipment here is holding at 918 degrees, and that's a very, very stable temperature for our glass to rest at. And at that temperature, it's not hot enough to slump, and it's not cold enough to induce thermal shock. So the piece can rest in here inside of our annealing oven as long as needed. And then at the end of the day, we have our control panel over here where we can press a button and it's going to send it down on a cycle of slow cooling. So the thickest portion of Colin's piece was obviously that solid foot that we had added right before we transferred the piece. And that was, maybe an inch and a half, or an inch to half an inch thick. And that's not a lot of thickness that we need, that needs a lot of time to anneal. So this will probably be in here for about 18 to 20 hours. To slowly cool down to room temperature where we can bring the piece out and it is usable. But the thicker the glass gets, the longer the annealing process. So for those that are familiar with our collection here at the museum, or if you're not, you should definitely come in and check out our big glass bench in our ancient gallery. That bench is about maybe 3.5 foot thick. It's very, very thick. And that piece had to anneal for 11 months to fully cool it, just because that thickness needs to disperse from the center all the way, pushing the stress out of the material to the surface. So it's just a really amazing thing to kind of see and understand how glass works and just how the material behaves under certain circumstances. So that does it for our demonstration. We thank you all for tuning in, We'll be doing plenty of these more coming up in the future now that we've kind of gotten it figured out and worked the kinks out. And thank you so much. We hope to see you here.